The house was suffocatingly quiet. It had only been 3 days. Just 3 days since I stood in the pouring rain and watched them lower my wife Beatrice into the cold earth. The scent of funeral lilies still clung to the curtains in the living room, a sickly sweet reminder that the woman I had slept next to for 40 years was gone forever. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table. My hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I was staring at her empty chair, my mind completely numb, my eyes burning from a deep, relentless exhaustion. That is when the heavy oak front door swung open without a knock. My daughter-in-law Monica marched into the foyer. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor. She did not offer a gentle smile. She did not ask how I was holding up or if I had eaten anything. Instead, she walked straight into my kitchen, stopped right across from me, and slammed a thick manila envelope onto the table. The sharp smack of the paper against the wood made me jump. I looked up, confused. "Dad, we cannot keep carrying this burden for you," she snapped. Her voice was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of pity. "It is time to sell this house." I sat there frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs. If you have ever been chased out of your own home by your own family, the very moment your spouse passed away, hit the like button and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I need to know I am not the only one who has faced this kind of cruelty. I am Richard Alden. Most folks around here just call me Rick. I am 70 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer in the harsh, unforgiving suburbs of Philadelphia. I woke up at 4 in the morning every single day. I spent decades inspecting steel beams in the freezing sleet, climbing scaffolding until my knees ached, and working double shifts so my family would never have to worry about a single thing. Every Friday for 4 straight decades, I walked through that front door and handed my entire paycheck to my wife. That was our arrangement. I made the money and she managed it. She took care of the bills, the savings, and the investments. We bought this beautiful 4-bedroom colonial home 30 years ago. I worked myself to the bone to pay it off early. 10 years ago, we sat at this very kitchen table, drank a cheap bottle of champagne, and celebrated burning the mortgage papers. This house was my sanctuary. It was the only thing I had left to my name. So when Monica stood there glaring at me like I was a burden, my grieving brain simply could not process her words. I reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the envelope toward me. Inside was a heavy sheet of paper with a bright red county seal stamped at the top. It was a property tax delinquency notice. I stared at the bold black numbers at the bottom of the page. It was a massive debt, a debt that had been compounding silently for over 5 years. I looked up at Monica, my vision blurring. "Monica," I whispered, my voice cracking. "There must be some kind of terrible mistake. Beatrice and I paid this house off 10 years ago. We do not have any debt. I gave her my pension checks every single month. I know the taxes were paid." Monica let out a short, cruel laugh. It sounded like ice cracking under heavy boots. "A mistake," she sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive coat. "There is no mistake, Dad. You have not paid a single dime in property taxes on this place in half a decade. The county is getting ready to foreclose. Do you even know what that means? It means they are going to kick you out to the curb." I stared back down at the red letters on the page. My chest tightened so hard I felt like I was having a heart attack. I could not breathe. I could not understand. For 40 years, I trusted Beatrice with every single penny I earned. She was meticulous. She kept a pristine locked ledger in her home office. Every Thursday afternoon, she dressed up, took her purse, and went to the bank. She never missed a Thursday. She told me she was depositing my checks and managing our joint retirement fund. How could we possibly owe the county thousands of dollars? Where did all my hard-earned money go? Monica leaned over the table, invading my space. The strong, overpowering smell of her perfume made me physically nauseous. "Look at you," she said, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You are a clueless old man. You have no idea what is actually going on around you, do you? Jason and I have our own lives. We have our own massive expenses. We cannot afford to bail you out of this disaster. The only logical solution is to put this property on the market immediately. We will take control of the sale, pay off your ridiculous tax debt with the proceeds, and put you somewhere more appropriate for your declining condition. My condition? I am 70 years old, not senile. But in that moment, sitting in the kitchen I had bled to build, I felt completely stripped of my dignity. The grief of losing the love of my life was still a raw, bleeding wound in my chest, and now my own daughter-in-law was pouring salt directly into it. I looked past Monica, staring at the open doorway, desperately hoping to see my son Jason walk through. I needed my boy. I needed him to tell his wife to back off, to tell her to show some basic respect to a grieving widower. But Jason was nowhere to be seen. He had stayed away. He had sent his wife to do the dirty work. He had sent her to bully a broken old man just 3 days after he buried his mother. I slowly stood up. My knees popped, but I forced myself to stand tall. I looked Monica dead in the eye. I am not selling my home, I said, my voice finally finding a steady, low rumble. And I am certainly not moving into a facility. You can tell my son that if he has something to say to me about my finances, he can come here and say it to my face. Monica rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. Suit yourself, old man, she spat, turning on her heel. But when the sheriff shows up to drag you out of here, do not bother calling us. She stormed out, slamming the heavy front door behind her so hard the framed photographs in the hallway rattled. I was left entirely alone in the suffocating silence. I looked down at the tax notice again. The numbers mocked me. A dark, ugly feeling began to coil in the pit of my stomach. It was not just fear. It was intuition. My gut was telling me that Beatrice had not made a mistake. She had not forgotten to pay the taxes. Something far more sinister had been happening right under my nose. I needed answers. And I was going to find them even if it tore my shattered heart into a million pieces. Just as I braced myself to move toward the phone, the front door opened again. The sound of soft, measured footsteps echoed in the hallway. I turned and saw my son Jason standing in the archway of the kitchen. Jason is 45 years old, and for his entire life he has been my absolute pride and joy. When he was born, I swore I would give him the world. I worked double shifts and ruined my knees on freezing construction sites just so he could go to the best universities. Today, he is the chief executive officer of a highly successful technology startup right here in the heart of the city. He drives expensive luxury cars and wears tailored Italian suits that cost more than I used to make in an entire year. Looking at him standing there with his expensive gray wool overcoat and perfectly styled hair, my initial anger melted into a desperate kind of relief. This was my boy. He would fix this. Dad. Jason said, his voice soft and trembling with what sounded like genuine exhaustion. He walked over and wrapped his arms around my shoulders in a tight embrace. I am so sorry about Monica. She had absolutely no right to speak to you that way. She is just overwhelmed and she let her anxiety get the better of her. Please forgive her. I let out a long, shaky breath and leaned into my son. I showed him the red stamped paper on the table. Jason. I do not understand what is happening here, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. Your wife just told me the house is going into foreclosure. She said your mother and I owe 5 years of back taxes. But that is impossible. You know how meticulous your mother was. Every Thursday she went to the bank. I gave her every paycheck. Where did the money go? Jason gently pulled out a chair and guided me to sit down. He took the seat next to me, reached across the table, and placed both of his warm hands over my cold, shaking ones. He looked down at the table for a long moment, his chest heaving with a deep sigh. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red and brimming with tears. Dad, I need you to listen to me very carefully. He began, his tone dropping to a gentle, heartbreaking whisper. I did not want to tell you this. I wanted to protect you from it, especially right now. But Monica forced my hand by coming over here. I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. Protect me from what, Jason? He squeezed my hands tightly. Mom was sick, Dad. She was very, very sick. I blinked in confusion. Sick? What do you mean, sick? She had a stroke, Jason. It was sudden. The doctors said it was completely out of the blue. Jason shook his head slowly, a single tear slipping down his cheek. That is just how it ended, Dad. But that is not how it started. For the last 5 years, Mom was suffering from early onset dementia. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I physically recoiled, pulling my hands back slightly. No, I stammered. No, that cannot be true. I lived with her every single day. We talked, we watched television, we ate our meals together. I would have noticed if my own wife was losing her mind. She was terrified of you finding out, Jason continued, his voice perfectly modulated, dripping with sorrow. You know how proud she was. She started forgetting things. Small things at first. Leaving the stove on, forgetting appointments, losing her keys. Then it got worse. She would get confused about dates and numbers. She came to me crying about 3 years ago, begging me not to tell you. She did not want you to look at her like she was a burden. She wanted to be your strong, capable Beatrice until the very end. I felt the room start to spin. My chest tightened as a wave of profound guilt crashed over me. Was it possible? Had I been so blind, so wrapped up in my own retirement routines that I failed to see the woman I loved slowly fading away right in front of me? But the money, I choked out, wiping a tear from my eye. The taxes, Jason. Even if she was sick, the money should still be in the bank. We had over $1 million saved for retirement. Jason sighed again, burying his face in his hands for a brief moment, before looking back at me with an expression of pure agony. Dad. When people lose their cognitive function, they do things that do not make sense. They become vulnerable. Mom got scared about the future. She started clicking on things on the internet. Investment schemes, online gambling platforms, fraudulent stock trading websites. She was pouring money into these black holes, convinced she was multiplying your retirement fund. When she lost it, she panicked and threw more money in to try and win it back. He pointed at the tax delinquency notice on the table. She stopped paying the property taxes because there was no money left to pay them. The retirement accounts are entirely drained, Dad. It is all gone. Every last cent. I sat there completely paralyzed. The kitchen walls felt like they were closing in on me. My beautiful, brilliant wife. Dying in secret, her mind unraveling, carrying the crushing weight of a massive financial disaster entirely on her own. The thought of her suffering in silence was so unbearable that I began to weep right there at the table. Jason stood up, walked around the table, and put his arm around me again. I am so sorry, Dad, he murmured softly. I tried to stop her when I found out, but she had already hidden the accounts from me. By the time I realized how bad it was, the money was gone. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a glossy folded brochure. He set it gently on the table in front of me. I looked down through my tears. It was a pamphlet for a place called the Whispering Pines Care Center. The cover featured a stock photo of an elderly man sitting alone in a small, sterile-looking room. It was a state-funded low-income nursing home. Dad, I know this is terrifying, Jason said, his voice smooth and incredibly persuasive. But the county is going to seize this house by the end of the month. You will have absolutely nothing. My tech startup is in the middle of a massive expansion phase, and all of my capital is tied up in company stock and vendor contracts. I do not have the liquid cash to pay off a 5-year tax debt right now. Our only option is to sell the house immediately before the government takes it." He tapped the glossy brochure with his perfectly manicured finger. "We can use whatever equity is left after the taxes are paid to get you settled here. It is safe, Dad. They have nurses around the clock. You will not have to worry about a thing. It is the only way to save you from ending up on the street." I looked at the brochure, then up at my son. His eyes were wide, earnest, and filled with what looked exactly like unconditional love. He was playing the part of the devoted son, trying to rescue his poor, helpless father from a disaster created by a tragically ill mother. It was a flawless, beautiful performance. And as I sat there drowning in grief and shock, I swallowed the hook completely. I almost believed every single word he said. As Jason hugged me goodbye and walked out the front door, leaving me alone once again in the suffocating silence of the house, a tiny voice in the back of my mind began to whisper. It was the voice of a man who had spent 40 years inspecting structural foundations. When a foundation is crumbling, there are cracks. There are warning signs. You do not just wake up one morning and find the building collapsed. I thought about Beatrice over the last 5 years. I thought about how she still completed the Sunday crossword puzzle in pen. I remembered how she sharply negotiated with the roofing contractor just 6 months ago, catching a mathematical error in his estimate. That was not a woman losing her cognitive function. That was a woman whose mind was as sharp as a diamond. My gut began to twist into a painful knot. The narrative my son had just spun with such tearful conviction simply did not match the reality of the woman I had lived with. I needed to see the damage for myself. I needed to see the proof of these supposed gambling addictions and failed investments. I grabbed my coat and ordered an Uber. My hands were shaking too badly to drive. The 10-minute ride to the local Wells Fargo branch felt like an absolute eternity. The gray Philadelphia sky seemed to press down on me, mirroring the heavy, crushing weight in my chest. I watched the familiar streets roll by, praying silently that Jason was right, that this was just a tragic illness and not something much darker. When the driver pulled up to the bank, I tipped him and walked through the heavy glass doors. The air inside was cool and sterile. I walked straight to the customer service desk. A young woman with a kind smile looked up over her name tag. "How can I help you today, sir?" she asked. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Richard Alden. My wife, Beatrice Alden, recently passed away. We hold a joint retirement account here, and I need to check the current balance." I slid my driver license and my wife's death certificate across the polished mahogany counter. The teller offered her polite condolences, took my documents, and began typing on her keyboard. I stood there gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. In my head, I kept visualizing our retirement fund. Over $1 million. Decades of frozen mornings, aching muscles, and overtime shifts, all converted into numbers on a screen. The teller stopped typing. Her eyebrows furrowed. She clicked the mouse a few times, leaned closer to her monitor, and then looked up at me with an expression of deep pity. "Mr. Alden," she said softly, "I am looking at the joint savings and retirement accounts. I am so sorry, but the current combined balance is exactly $400. The words hit me like a physical blow. $400. A lifetime of absolute devotion reduced to the cost of a cheap television. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Where did it go?" I demanded, my voice rising, slightly echoing in the quiet bank lobby. "My son told me she lost it online. He said she was gambling. He said she made bad investments. I need you to print the statements. I need to see where my money went over the last 5 years. I need to see the names of those websites." The teller nodded quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I can print the transaction history for you, sir. Let me pull up the last 5 years. Wait, let me look further back just to be sure." The printer behind her whirred to life. It began spitting out page after page of dense financial records. She gathered the thick stack of papers, stapled them together, and handed them to me across the counter. I took the papers. They felt heavy, They felt like a death sentence. I walked over to a quiet leather chair in the corner of the lobby and sat down. I pulled reading glasses from my pocket and scanned the pages. I was looking for the chaos Jason had described. I was looking for massive wire transfers to sketchy offshore accounts, erratic credit card charges to online casinos, desperate financial decisions made by a confused, dying mind. But as my eyes moved down the columns of numbers, my heart stopped beating. The panic in my chest was suddenly replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. There were no gambling websites. There were no bad stock market investments. There was no chaos at all. What I saw on those pages was the exact opposite of a confused mind. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculating precision. I traced my finger along the dates. Every single Thursday afternoon, precisely at 2 in the afternoon, there was a withdrawal. It was not a random amount. I looked at the deposit column where my paycheck went in every Friday. I did the math in my head. The withdrawal on Thursday was exactly 15% of my total deposit. Exactly 15%. Not a penny more, not a penny less. I flipped frantically back through the pages. Last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The pattern never broke. Every single Thursday for 40 straight years, Beatrice had walked into this very bank and siphoned off 15% of my life. She transferred those funds into an undisclosed account at a different banking institution. An account that did not have my name on it. An account that Jason knew nothing about, or perhaps knew everything about. This was not the erratic behavior of a woman suffering from early-onset dementia. This was a methodical 40-year heist. The woman I loved had not lost her mind. She had been stealing from me since the very first day we were married. I rode the Uber back to my house in silence. The stack of bank statements rested on my lap, heavy as a tombstone. An hour ago, I was a grieving widower trying to make sense of an illness that supposedly stole my wife's mind. Now I was a man who discovered he spent his adult life sleeping next to a stranger. When I walked through the front door, the silence of the house did not feel mournful anymore. It felt mocking. The scent of funeral lilies still hung in the air, but it no longer made me want to weep. I did not shed a single tear. The suffocating sadness that anchored me to the floor for 3 days evaporated, replaced by a cold focus. My grief burned away, leaving behind the hardened instincts of a structural engineer. I spent 40 years inspecting buildings looking for hidden stress fractures and structural lies. Now I was going to inspect my own life. I walked into the kitchen, threw my coat over a chair, and spread the bank statements across the table. I stared at the relentless precision of her betrayal. Every Thursday, exactly 15%. I poured a black coffee, drank it cold, and let the bitter taste anchor me to reality. As I sat there in the fading light, the memories of those Thursday afternoons came flooding back to me with sickening clarity. I vividly remembered how Beatrice prepared for them. While I was miles away, covered in concrete dust and sweat, shivering in the brutal Pennsylvania winters, my wife was engaging in an elegant ritual. Every Thursday morning, she would spend an hour in front of her vanity mirror. She chose her finest clothes, usually a tailored wool skirt and a silk blouse. She would apply her expensive French perfume clasp, her pearl necklace around her throat, and grab her designer purse. When I occasionally took a Thursday off to rest my aching back, I watched her head toward the front door. I would ask her where she was going, looking so beautiful. She would flash me that perfect smile, kiss my rough cheek, and tell me she was heading to her women's charity group. She claimed they were raising money for underprivileged families. She said she was helping those who had nothing. The sheer audacity of the lie made my stomach churn. She was not helping the poor. She was systematically siphoning my lifeblood dollar by dollar, year after year, with a beautiful smile on her face. The sun went down, plunging the house into shadows. I did not turn on the main lights. I grabbed a brass flashlight from the utility drawer and began my search. I started in her home office. I pulled out every drawer of her mahogany desk, dumping files onto the rug. I sifted through decades of tax returns and utility bills. I checked the back of picture frames. I thumped the drywall, listening for hollow spaces. I was methodical, relentless, and completely numb to the mess I was making. When the office yielded nothing, I moved directly to our master bedroom. I tore through her massive walk-in closet. I checked the pockets of every winter coat, every silk dress, and every designer handbag she purchased with my money. I pulled up the edges of the carpet. I checked beneath the heavy oak mattress frame. Hours passed. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, then 1 in the morning. My back screamed in agony, reminding me of my 70 years of hard labor, but pure adrenaline pushed the pain aside. She had to have kept a record. A woman who executes a 40-year financial heist does not just memorize the destination of that much stolen wealth. There had to be a ledger or a key hidden somewhere in this house. By 2 in the morning, I was standing in the middle of our bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of her belongings. My eyes landed on the antique wooden vanity table sitting in the corner of the room. It was the spot where she sat every Thursday morning, carefully painting her face before going to the bank to rob me. I walked over to it. I pulled out the small velvet-lined drawers containing her expensive jewelry, makeup brushes, and imported perfumes. I emptied them onto the floor without a thought. I shone my flashlight inside the empty wooden cavities, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I was about to turn away when my engineer instincts flared. The bottom drawer did not slide out as deeply as the top ones. The exterior dimensions of the vanity suggested there should be at least 2 more inches of depth. I dropped to my knees, wincing, as the joint popped loudly in the quiet room. I pulled the bottom drawer out completely, removing it from its metal tracks. I flipped the heavy wooden drawer upside down and shined the beam of the flashlight onto its underside. My breath caught in my throat. Taped to the rough, unfinished wood at the very back of the drawer was a thick, yellow envelope. My calloused hands trembled as I ripped the heavy packaging tape away. I opened the envelope and let the contents slide out onto the carpet. It was a single long silver key with a square head. Stamped into the cold metal was the blue octagon logo of Chase Bank, along with a sequence of numbers. Beside the key was a small laminated card bearing the address of a Chase branch located in a wealthy, secluded suburb exactly 20 miles away. It was a bank we had never used, a bank I had never set foot in during our marriage. I sat there in the dark, clutching the cold silver key in my palm. The weeping, broken widower was completely gone. Tomorrow morning, when those doors opened, I was going to turn that key, and I was going to uncover the rest of my dead wife's secret life. The morning light crept through the broken blinds of my bedroom, washing the absolute wreckage of my wife's belongings in a pale, unforgiving gray. I had not slept a single second. I sat in a wooden chair facing the window, simply holding the silver Chase Bank key in my right hand, feeling its jagged edges press against my calloused skin. By 8 in the morning, I was in my truck. I did not shower or shave. I drove out of my working-class neighborhood and headed toward the wealthy, secluded suburb printed on the laminated card. The drive took exactly 40 minutes. As I crossed into the affluent zip code, the scenery changed drastically. The modest row houses and cracked sidewalks of my world gave way to sprawling estates, manicured lawns, and high-end boutiques. This was where my wife had been coming every single Thursday. She left the life we built together and stepped into this world of luxury fueled by the money she bled from my veins. I pulled into the parking lot of the Chase Bank branch. It was a pristine, modern building composed of white stone and dark-tinted glass. It looked less like a bank and more like an exclusive country club. I turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. My heart was pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs, but my hands were completely still. I walked through the double doors and was immediately greeted by a security guard who tipped his hat. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly to the branch manager's glass office. I knocked once and stepped inside. The manager, a young man in a sharp blue suit, looked up with a polite, practiced smile. I placed the silver key, Beatrice's death certificate, and our marriage license on his pristine glass desk. "My name is Richard Alden," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "My wife passed away 3 days ago. I need to access her safe deposit box." The manager inspected the documents carefully. His smile faded into an expression of professional sympathy. "Of course, Mr. Alden. I am very sorry for your loss. Please follow me." He grabbed his master key and led me out of the office, down a brightly lit hallway, and into the vault. The heavy steel door stood open, revealing walls lined with hundreds of identical metal compartments. The air inside the vault was noticeably colder. The manager checked the number stamped on my key. "Box 408, he murmured. He walked down the third aisle, stopped at eye level, and inserted his master key into the left lock. I inserted my silver key into the right lock. We turned them simultaneously. With a heavy metallic click, the small door swung open. The manager respectfully stepped out of the vault, leaving me entirely alone. I stood there, staring into the dark, rectangular cavity. I reached inside and gripped the handle of the long metal security box. It was surprisingly heavy. I pulled it out, carried it over to the private viewing room attached to the vault, and set it down on the polished wooden table. I closed the door behind me, sealing myself in total silence. I took a deep breath and flipped the lid open. Part of me expected to see stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. Another part of me expected offshore bank account numbers or gold bars. But there was no cash inside. The box contained no jewelry, no sentimental letters, and no hidden savings accounts. Instead, there were 3 very thick, heavy-duty manila folders stacked neatly on top of one another. I reached in and pulled out the top folder. The label on the tab read, "Rittenhouse Square." I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of crisp, notarized legal documents. My eyes scanned the heavy black text. It was a property deed. Specifically, it was the deed to a luxury rental condominium located in one of the most expensive, highly sought-after neighborhoods in downtown Philadelphia. I flipped to the second page to see the financial details. The property had been purchased entirely with cash. The purchase price was nearly $400,000. I quickly opened the second folder. It contained another deed for a different luxury apartment, also purchased in cash. I slowly opened the third folder. Another deed. Another luxury condo. Another cash purchase. I placed the 3 deeds side by side on the viewing table. Together, the 3 properties represented over $1 million in real estate. The exact amount that had been siphoned out of my Wells Fargo retirement fund over the last 40 years. Beatrice had not gambled my money away. She had not lost it on foolish internet scams like my son claimed. She had meticulously laundered my paychecks into prime, incredibly lucrative cash-flowing real estate. My mind raced as I tried to process the sheer scale of the deception. But the true devastating horror had not even hit me yet. I leaned closer to the table, tracing my finger down to the bottom of the first deed, looking for the section that listed the legal owner. I expected to see Beatrice's name. I fully prepared myself to see that my wife had secretly built a real estate empire for herself. But her name was nowhere to be found. The sole legal owner listed in bold ink on the official county-stamped deed was Jason Alden, my own son. I frantically checked the second deed. Jason Alden. I checked the third deed. Jason Alden. The room began to spin. The air was sucked out of my lungs. My son, the man who held me in his arms yesterday, the man who cried, whined fake tears of sorrow, and told me my wife had lost her mind, was the sole beneficiary of her 40-year crime. His lies were designed to protect his stolen wealth. I sat perfectly still in the small soundproof viewing room. The 3 property deeds lay spread across the table like a winning hand in a crooked card game. I stared at Jason's name printed in bold black ink, trying to reconcile the brilliant, successful CEO son I thought I knew with the thief who had quietly siphoned away my life savings. My mind went back to all those times Jason had bragged about his self-made success. He loved telling the story of how he started his tech company in a small garage, surviving on instant noodles using nothing but his own sheer brilliance and relentless hustle to build a $1 million empire. He had given magazine interviews about his entrepreneurial genius. I remembered how proud I felt reading those articles. I remembered bragging to the guys on the construction site about my boy. Now, looking at the truth laid bare on the mahogany table, I realized his empire was not built on his genius at all. It was built on the broken back, the aching knees, and the stolen equity of his old man. But the sickness in my stomach told me the betrayal was not over. I looked back down into the dark metal interior of Safe Deposit Box 408. There was one more document lying flat at the very bottom. It was not in a thick manila folder like the deeds. It was just a thin, transparent plastic sleeve containing a few sheets of paper. I reached in and pulled it out. The paper felt heavy, official, and ominous. The header at the top of the first page read, "General Durable Power of Attorney." My eyes scanned the legal jargon, jumping from paragraph to paragraph, trying to decipher the thick wall of text. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in blue ink, was my signature, Richard Thomas Alden. The signature looked exactly like mine. The loop of the capital R, the sharp cross of the T, the slight downward slant at the end. It was a perfect, flawless forgery. But I had never signed this document. I had never even seen this document in my entire life. I flipped to the second page. Stamped near the bottom was the raised embossed seal of a public notary. The date on the stamp was exactly 5 years ago. I closed my eyes, trying to piece the timeline together. 5 years ago. That was the exact same time Jason's tech startup suddenly exploded with success. He went from struggling to pay his rent to moving into a massive state-of-the-art office building downtown. He had told me he finally secured a major round of venture capital funding. He said a group of wealthy angel investors believed in his vision and wrote him a massive check. We had celebrated that night. I bought him an expensive bottle of scotch to toast his success. I opened my eyes and looked back at the forged document in my hands. Attached to the back of the power of attorney was a secondary file. It was a loan agreement from a predatory lending company I had never heard of before. The details of the loan were clearly outlined on the front page. Beatrice had used the forged power of attorney to take out a massive reverse mortgage on our fully paid-off colonial home. She had borrowed $500,000 against the equity of the house I had bled for decades to own free and clear. I traced my finger down the loan document, looking for the destination of the funds. There it was, plainly typed in black and white. The entire $500,000 had not been deposited into our joint account. It had been wired directly into the corporate business account of Jason's tech startup, the venture capital funding, the angel investors. It was all a complete and utter lie. There were no investors. There was only a mother willing to forge her husband's signature, steal the roof over his head, and funnel the cash to her golden child. And the most sickening part of all was the realization of why I was suddenly receiving a property tax delinquency notice. A reverse mortgage required the homeowner to stay current on all property taxes and insurance premiums. If the taxes went unpaid, the lender had the legal right to foreclose on the property and seize the asset. Beatrice had taken out the loan, handed the cash to Jason, and then intentionally stopped paying the property taxes. She let the debt accumulate for 5 years, knowing full well that eventually the county would step in and kick me out onto the street. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Monica had not shown up at my house yesterday by accident. Jason had not played the role of the comforting, tearful son by chance. They knew the tax debt was coming due. They knew the foreclosure was imminent. They had planned this exact scenario for 5 years. They expected me to panic. They expected me to believe the story about Beatrice losing her mind and gambling our savings away. They expected me to blindly agree to sell the house, allowing them to quietly pay off the reverse mortgage, with the proceeds of the sale hiding their crime forever. And once the house was sold, I would be discarded. I would be shoved into the bleak state-funded nursing home on that glossy brochure Jason had so helpfully provided. They would walk away with their stolen real estate empire and their tech company built on my stolen money, while I rotted away in a tiny room, believing my wife was simply a tragic victim of a terrible disease. I sat in the quiet viewing room surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of my family's treachery. The anger inside me did not explode. It did not make me want to scream or throw things against the wall. Instead, it crystallized into something cold, hard, and incredibly dangerous. I carefully placed the deeds, the forged power of attorney, and the reverse mortgage documents back into the manila folders. I slid everything back into the metal box, closed the lid, and carried it back into the vault. I locked the box, slid my silver key into my pocket, and walked out of the bank into the bright morning sunlight. Jason thought he was dealing with a clueless, broken old man who would simply roll over and accept his fate. He thought his emotional manipulation had worked perfectly. He thought he had won. But he had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the man who built him. I had spent 40 years constructing buildings designed to withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. I knew exactly how to reinforce a foundation, and more importantly, I knew exactly where to strike to make an entire structure come crashing down. I got back into my truck, turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot. It was time to pay my son a visit. It was time to let him know that the game had officially changed. I drove back to my house with a terrifying calm. The panic and sorrow were gone, replaced by the calculated precision of a man preparing for a demolition. I walked into the kitchen and laid the photocopies of the deeds, the forged power of attorney, and the reverse mortgage on the table. I arranged them like blueprints. Then I dialed my son. I made my voice sound weak and defeated. "Jason," I said, "I am overwhelmed. I do not know what to do. Please come over. I think you are right about selling the house." I heard the triumphant smile in his voice as he told me he would be there in 20 minutes. He thought I was broken. 20 minutes later, Jason walked into the kitchen wearing that same practiced look of empathetic sorrow. He carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the legal paperwork needed to strip me of my last asset. "Dad," he said softly, walking toward the table, "I know how hard this is. You are making the right choice. We will get you taken care of." I kept my eyes fixed on the folders. "Have a seat, Jason," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was flat and hard. Jason hesitated, sensing the shift in my tone, but his arrogance pushed him forward. He sat across from me, placing his briefcase on the floor. "What is going on, Dad?" he asked. I flipped open the first folder and slid the Rittenhouse Square deed across the table. Jason looked down. The blood drained from his face. His jaw muscles tightened. I opened the second folder and slid the second deed across. Then the third. I watched his eyes dart across the pages, recognizing his name printed on the properties bought with my stolen savings. Finally, I slid the forged power of attorney and the reverse mortgage contract into the center. "You told me your mother lost her mind," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You sat in this very room, looked me directly in the eyes, and cried. You told me she gambled our retirement away. But there are no gambling debts. There is only a 40-year trail of embezzlement, 3 luxury condos in your name, and a fraudulent loan that funded your tech company." For a long moment, the kitchen was silent. I waited for him to deny it. I waited for him to make up another elaborate lie or perhaps beg for forgiveness. But he did none of those things. Instead, my son leaned back in his chair. The fake sympathy vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold emptiness. His shoulders relaxed. A slow, chilling smirk spread across his face. You went to the bank, he said. His voice was no longer soft. It was sharp, laced with pure venom. I told Mom she was getting sloppy keeping that key in the house. I told her to throw it away, but she was always too sentimental. You helped her steal from me, I whispered, the pure cruelty of his tone making my stomach turn. I broke my back for 40 years to give you absolutely everything, and you colluded with her to rob me blind. Jason laughed. It was a short, very bitter sound. Oh, please, Dad. Spare me the martyr routine. You had no vision. You had all that money sitting in a useless savings account while I had a business idea that could change the world. Mom saw my potential. She knew you would never understand. She invested in a winner. She committed federal fraud. I fired back, my anger breaking through the calm exterior. And so did you. That signature is a forgery. You stole the equity out of this house and deliberately stopped paying the property taxes so the county would foreclose and hide your tracks. You were going to throw me into a nursing home while you lived in luxury. Jason leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the table. His smirk widened into absolute arrogance. And what exactly are you going to do about it, old man? He challenged. Are you going to sue me? With what money? Your accounts are empty. Are you going to call the police? Tell them your dead wife forged your signature. It is in black and white. If you drag this into court, Mom goes down as a fraud in her grave. Her legacy will be destroyed. The community will know she was a thief. And while you are fighting a legal battle, you cannot afford the bank forecloses on you anyway. I stared at him, horrified. He had thought of everything. He had weaponized my love for his mother to shield himself from his crimes. Jason picked up his briefcase and placed it on the table. He snapped the locks open, pulled out a stack of legal documents, and tossed a black pen on top. You have no moves left, Dad, he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. You are broke, alone, and about to be homeless. If you try to fight me, you will die on the streets. Sign the house over to me right now. I will handle the tax debt, sell the property, and make sure you get a bed in that nursing home. It is not the Ritz, but it is better than sleeping under a bridge. He stood up, buttoning his coat, looking down at me like I was an insect. I will give you until next Friday to sign those papers, he said coldly. After that, I wash my hands of you. Make the smart choice for once in your life. He turned and walked straight out. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo down the hallway. The front door slammed shut. I sat alone, staring at the black pen resting on the surrender documents. My own son believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner. But as I looked at the pen, a very dark, terrible thought finally formed. I sat there staring at the black pen Jason had tossed onto the table like a bone thrown to a starving dog. The house was dead quiet again, but the silence now felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He had given me until next Friday. 7 days to surrender my home, my dignity, and my entire life. Over the next 48 hours, my son did not call. He did not visit. Instead, he let his expensive legal team do the talking. Starting Monday morning, a relentless barrage of certified letters began arriving at my front door. His lawyers were ruthless. They sent formal notices of intent to evict. They sent thick packets of legal threats outlining exactly how they would seize the property, freeze whatever meager assets I had left, and force me out onto the street. The legal jargon was cold and precise, designed to break my spirit and intimidate me into immediate compliance. I spent those days wandering through the empty rooms of my house, touching the walls I had painted, looking at the hardwood floors I had installed on my hands and knees. Every corner of this home held a memory, and every single memory was now tainted by the absolute certainty of my wife's betrayal. I felt an overwhelming despair pulling me under. I was a 70-year-old man with $400 to my name, fighting a millionaire tech executive who happened to be my own flesh and blood. I was outmatched, outgunned, and running out of time. I started packing a few cardboard boxes, resigning myself to the reality that I might actually end up in that bleak state-funded facility. I was packing away old photographs when I reached for a heavy crystal vase on the top shelf of the living room bookcase. As I lifted the heavy glass vase down from the shelf, I stopped dead in my tracks. I stood in the middle of the living room, holding the heavy crystal in both hands. I stared at my fingers gripped around the glass. I held it out in front of me, suspended in the air. My hands were perfectly, absolutely still. There was not even the slightest tremor. I set the vase down on a nearby table and held both of my hands out in front of my chest, spreading my fingers wide. They were as steady as carved stone. I blinked my mind, struggling to process what I was looking at. For the past 5 years, my hands had shaken so violently I could barely hold a cup of coffee in the morning without spilling it. It was a severe, unpredictable tremor that had forced me to retire from structural engineering 2 years earlier than I had planned. I could no longer hold a drafting pencil or safely climb a steel scaffold. I had accepted it as a cruel symptom of aging. But standing there in the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and eviction notices, my hands were rock solid. My heart began to race, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I waited for the familiar crushing pain in my chest to follow. For the last 5 years, any sudden spike in my heart rate, any moment of stress or exertion, was immediately followed by a terrifying tightness in my chest. It was a heavy, agonizing pressure that would radiate down my left arm, leaving me gasping for air and clinging to the nearest piece of furniture. My doctor had run countless electrocardiograms and stress tests, but he could never pinpoint the exact cause. He prescribed blood thinners and beta blockers, warning me that my heart was mysteriously failing and that I needed to prepare for the worst. Beatrice had been so incredibly supportive. She would sit by my bed, rubbing my shoulder, telling me she would take care of everything. She told me to stop worrying about the finances and focus entirely on resting. She made sure I stayed in the house, too dizzy and weak to drive, too exhausted to look at the bank statements she was manipulating. I took a long, deep breath. I filled my lungs to absolute capacity, stretching my chest to its limits. There was no pain. There was no tightness. There was only the clean, clear sensation of oxygen filling my healthy lungs. I paced rapidly back and forth across the living room, intentionally trying to trigger the dizzy spells that used to leave me bedridden for entire weekends. I spun around quickly, but the room remained perfectly stable. My balance was flawless. The chronic fatigue that weighed my limbs down like lead for half a decade was completely gone. I felt an incredible surge of physical energy that I had not experienced since my early 60s. I walked slowly into the hallway and stared at my reflection in the large mirror. The pale, sickly old man who had looked back at me just a week ago was gone. Color had returned to my cheeks. My eyes were clear. The dark circles under my eyes had vanished. I stood there staring at my healthy reflection as a chilling, horrifying epiphany washed over me like freezing water. The timeline of my mysterious illness aligned perfectly with their crime. My tremors, my chest pains, and my debilitating dizzy spells began exactly 5 years ago. They began the exact same month Beatrice forged my signature on the power of attorney. They began the exact same week Jason launched his tech company using my stolen equity. And now, as I stood in my living room facing eviction, I realized the most terrifying detail of all. My symptoms had not gradually faded away. They had stopped abruptly. They completely vanished the exact day Beatrice died. My wife was not just stealing my money to fund my son. She was systematically destroying my body to ensure I never had the strength to stop them. I was not dying of old age. I was being murdered. I stood perfectly still in front of the hallway mirror, staring at the face of a man who had narrowly escaped his own execution. The horrifying truth paralyzed me. I was not dying of old age. I was being murdered. My mind began to race backward, tearing through 5 years of memories, desperately searching for the weapon. Beatrice did not own a gun. She was terrified of knives. If she was slowly poisoning me, how was she delivering the dose right in front of my eyes? Then a specific memory surfaced. It hit me so hard my knees buckled, forcing me to lean against the wall for support. The timeline snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. Every Thursday afternoon, Beatrice went to the bank to steal my money. And every Thursday night, without fail, she would return home and prepare for the evening routine. We would eat dinner together at the kitchen table. I would usually be exhausted from a long day at the construction site. She would clear the plates, wipe down the counters, and tell me to go sit in my favorite recliner in the living room. Then she would brew her special tea. She never let me make it myself. She always claimed it was an ancient holistic herbal remedy she discovered through her women's charity group. She said it was specifically blended to strengthen my heart and calm my severe anxiety. I can still see her walking into the living room, holding the steaming ceramic mug in her hands. The smell was always incredibly pungent, earthy, and slightly metallic, masking a bitter taste that made my stomach churn. But she would stand right there in front of my chair. She would not go wash the dishes. She would not turn on the television. She would stand over me, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, and watch me with those warm, loving eyes. "Drink it while it is hot." "Richard," she would say softly, "it will not work if it gets cold." I would force the bitter liquid down my throat, gagging slightly at the taste. She would not leave the room until I had swallowed every single drop and handed the empty mug back to her. Only then would she smile, kiss my forehead, and tell me I was going to feel so much better. My stomach violently rejected the memory. I rushed to the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the porcelain basin dry, heaving as the phantom taste of the metallic tea coated my tongue. I had to find it. I needed to know exactly what she had been feeding me. I tore through the kitchen cabinets, pulling out every box of tea we owned. I dumped them onto the counter, but none matched the dark powder she used on Thursday nights. I stopped and forced myself to think like her. She was a meticulous, calculating predator. She would never leave the murder weapon in the kitchen, where I might accidentally stumble upon it. She kept her darkest secrets locked away. I turned my head and looked straight toward the basement door. I grabbed my brass flashlight and headed down the wooden stairs into the damp, unfinished basement. The air down here was always thick and musty. Beatrice had a small corner dedicated to her gardening supplies. Against the far wall sat a heavy dark green metal cabinet. She always kept it locked with a small brass padlock, claiming it held toxic fertilizers and pest control chemicals. I walked over to the workbench, grabbed a heavy iron crowbar, and approached the green cabinet. I wedged the flat edge of the crowbar behind the padlock hasp and pulled back with all my newly recovered strength. The screws ripped out of the cheap metal with a loud screech. The cabinet doors swung open. I shined the flashlight over the shelves. There were a few bags of potting soil and some dusty ceramic pots. But on the very top shelf, tucked behind a rusty watering can, was a plain, unmarked silver tin. It was about the size of a coffee can with a tight-fitting metal lid. I reached up and pulled it down. My hands were perfectly steady, but my heart was hammering violently. I popped the lid off. The smell hit me instantly. It was the exact same pungent, earthy odor that had filled my living room every Thursday night. I looked inside. The tin was half full of a dark, coarse, dried herbal mixture. Mixed into the leaves was a fine white powder. I snapped the lid back on tightly. I knew I could not simply take this to the local police station. If I walked in with a wild story about my dead wife plotting to murder me, they would treat me like a delusional old man. Jason would use his money to bury the investigation before it even started. He would tell the authorities I was senile and use it to fast-track my committal to the nursing home. I needed undeniable scientific proof. I went upstairs, placed the tin in a large plastic bag, and searched for private toxicology laboratories. I found a specialized facility located in a commercial business park about an hour north of the city. I grabbed my wallet. I had exactly $350 in cash left to my name. I drove my truck up the interstate, the silver tin sitting on the passenger seat like a bomb. I arrived at the laboratory and walked to the reception desk. I placed the bag on the counter and slid my money across the desk. I need a full chemical and toxin analysis on this material, I said, my voice cold and flat. The technician looked at my face, noticing the deadly seriousness in my eyes. He simply nodded, printed a receipt, and told me the final results would be ready in exactly 48 hours. I was finally ready for a brutal legal war. I drove away from the toxicology laboratory with a terrifying clarity. I knew what my family had done, but I also knew I could not fight this battle alone. I needed a gladiator. I did not need a friendly neighborhood attorney who specialized in peaceful mediations. I needed a shark. I needed someone who understood the dark, corrupt underbelly of the legal system and knew exactly how to tear a wealthy opponent to shreds. I remembered a name from a massive commercial construction dispute I worked on a decade ago. Thomas Reed. He was a ruthless former state prosecutor who had a reputation for completely destroying his rivals in the courtroom before moving into high-stakes private practice. He was brilliant, entirely merciless, and incredibly expensive. I drove straight to his law firm in the center of the financial district. I walked into his imposing glass-walled office with nothing but my stack of photocopied deeds, the forged power of attorney, and the $300 I had left in my pocket. Thomas Reed sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp, predatory eyes and a tailored suit that commanded absolute authority. He listened in complete silence as I laid out the 40-year trail of stolen money, the hidden safe deposit box, the secret luxury condos, and the reverse mortgage that funded my son's technology empire. Then I told him about the sudden disappearance of my severe physical symptoms and the tin of herbal tea I had just dropped off at the private laboratory. I expected him to look at me with skepticism. I expected him to tell me I was a paranoid old man grasping at straws. Instead, Thomas leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and looked at the documents with a terrifying, predatory hunger. He saw the exact same structural cracks in Jason's perfect story that I did. He agreed to take my case immediately, deferring his massive fees until we seized my stolen assets back. Over the next 48 hours, while I sat in my empty house completely ignoring the endless barrage of eviction notices and threatening voicemails from Jason's legal team, Thomas went to war. He possessed the legal authority and the deep network of investigative connections required to rip the lid off my wife's secret financial life. He immediately issued emergency subpoenas to the Chase Bank branch, demanding the complete transaction history of the hidden account my wife had used to launder my paychecks every Thursday afternoon. He wanted to trace every single dollar that went into that account and see exactly where it flowed before it purchased those luxury properties. I waited in absolute agony, pacing the floors of my home, praying the laboratory would call with the poison results and wondering what else Thomas would uncover in the dark corners of my stolen wealth. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after my wife's funeral, my phone finally rang. It was Thomas. His voice was completely devoid of its usual sharp confidence. It sounded heavy, grave, and laced with a deep, unexpected disgust. He told me to come down to his office immediately. I grabbed my coat and drove into the city, my heart hammering against my ribs the entire way. When I walked into his private suite, Thomas did not greet me with a handshake. He was standing by his floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city skyline. His desk was covered in thick stacks of freshly printed financial records. He turned around, looked me dead in the eye, and sighed heavily. "Richard," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious rumble. I followed the money. I tracked every single Thursday deposit for the last 20 years. The real estate was only a fraction of their operation. There is something else. Something much worse. I felt the blood drain from my face. I walked over to the desk and braced myself against the heavy wood. Worse than stealing my home. Worse than funding a business with my blood. "What did you find, Thomas?" He walked over and picked up a thick black folder. He did not open it immediately. He held it in his hands, looking at me with an expression of profound pity. Your wife was a very calculating woman, Richard. She did not just buy those 3 luxury rental condos for your son. She was also paying massive recurring monthly premiums to a private insurance broker. She was funneling thousands of dollars of your hard-earned money every single year into premium payments. I stared at him. Insurance premiums? What kind of insurance? Was she insuring the rental properties? Thomas shook his head. No, Richard. She was not insuring the real estate. She was insuring you. He flipped the black folder open and turned it around so I could read the documents. My eyes scanned the thick, heavily redacted pages. They were life insurance policies, but they were not standard modest policies designed to cover funeral expenses. They were massive, comprehensive corporate tier policies. There were 3 separate accounts taken out with 3 different major insurance conglomerates. Each policy was aggressively funded using the money she stole from me every Thursday. I looked at the payout numbers listed in bold black ink at the bottom of the pages. The total combined death benefit was staggering. It was over $4 million. My life had a literal price tag attached to it. But the final, most devastating blow was yet to come. I leaned closer to the documents, my hands shaking violently, as I searched for the designated beneficiary. I already knew the answer in my heart, but seeing it printed in undeniable black ink shattered whatever tiny piece of my soul I had left. The sole beneficiary listed on all 3 multi-million-dollar life insurance policies was Jason Alden. He was not just stealing my present. He was eagerly waiting to profit immensely from my quickly approaching death. I stood in Thomas's office, the air suddenly feeling as thick as wet concrete. He was eagerly waiting to profit immensely from my quickly approaching death. The $4 million figure stared back at me from the black folder burning itself into my mind. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. They had calculated the monetary value of my life and decided I was worth more dead. Thomas slowly closed the folder, the heavy cardboard making a dull thud against the desk. He looked at me, his predatory eyes filled with rare sympathy. Richard, he began softly, but before he could finish his sentence, my cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The sharp buzzing broke the silence. I reached into my pocket and pulled the phone out. The caller identification displayed the toxicology laboratory. I looked up at Thomas. My heart felt like it was going to burst. It is the lab, I whispered. Thomas walked around his desk, pointing to the speaker button. Answer it, he instructed, his voice returning to its sharp professional edge. I pressed the speaker icon. Yes, this is Richard Alden, I said, my voice echoing. Mr. Alden, a sterile clinical voice replied through the tiny speaker. This is Dr. Aris from the toxicology department. We have completed the chemical analysis on the sample of herbal tea you provided 2 days ago. I need you to listen very carefully. Are you currently in a safe location? Yes, I answered, gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I am with my attorney. What did you find in the tea? There was a brief, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I heard the shuffling of paper. Mr. Alden, the doctor, continued, his tone devoid of any emotion. The organic matter in the tin is a standard harmless chamomile and valerian root blend. However, the white powder mixed into the leaves is not part of any herbal remedy. It is arsenic trioxide. It is a highly toxic, lethal substance. The word hit me like a physical blow. Arsenic. I felt my knees buckle, but Thomas caught my arm, holding me steady. The doctor kept speaking, laying out the horrific mechanics of my wife's betrayal. The concentration in the tin was relatively low, he explained. If someone were to ingest this over a prolonged period, say several years, it would not cause immediate violent poisoning. Instead, it would slowly and systematically destroy the cardiovascular system. It causes severe hand tremors, debilitating dizzy spells, and chronic chest pain. Ultimately, it leads to a gradual catastrophic heart failure that perfectly mimics natural aging or coronary disease in elderly patients. It is a very calculated method, Mr. Alden. Whoever mixed this intended to kill you, slowly ensuring it looked like a natural death. I strongly advise you to contact the authorities immediately. We are required by law to report these findings to the state police. I thanked the doctor and ended the call. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the polished wood of the desk. I did not scream. I did not punch the wall. Instead, I collapsed into one of the heavy leather guest chairs, buried my face in my hands, and began to weep. I wept with a deep, guttural intensity, but my tears were not born of grief. They were born of absolute, pure disgust. I thought about all those Thursday nights. I thought about sitting in my comfortable recliner, exhausted from breaking my back to provide for my family. I thought about Beatrice standing over me with that warm, loving smile on her face, holding the ceramic mug. "Drink it while it is hot, Richard." She had watched me swallow poison every single week for 5 years. She watched my body wither away, watched my hands shake so badly I had to give up my career. And she smiled. She rubbed my back while my heart struggled to pump blood, knowing exactly what she was doing. And Jason knew. He knew the money funding his lavish lifestyle, and his technology empire was soaked in my blood. They were not just greedy thieves who wanted my real estate. They were cold, calculating murderers patiently waiting for my heart to finally give out so they could collect $4 million in insurance payouts. As the tears streamed down my face, a profound, chilling realization washed over my entire being. For the past week, I had cursed the universe for taking my wife away so suddenly. I had stood at her grave in the pouring rain, wondering why a healthy woman would just collapse from a massive stroke without any warning. Now, sitting in the cold light of the law office, I understood the truth. Her sudden death was not a tragedy. It was a miracle. It was an act of divine intervention. If Beatrice had lived even a few months longer, the arsenic would have completely destroyed my heart. I would have died in my bed, believing I was loved, leaving my entire legacy to the very monsters who killed me. Her stroke was the only thing that stopped the poison. It was the only thing that saved my life. I wiped the tears from my face and slowly stood up. The weeping old man was gone forever. The disgust in my stomach hardened into an unbreakable, freezing resolve. I looked at Thomas. He was already drafting documents on his legal pad, his eyes burning with the anticipation of a slaughter. "They wanted me to die slowly," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. "They wanted to take my home, my money, and my life." Thomas stopped writing his notes and looked up at me. "We are going to take everything from him, Richard," he promised. I nodded. "Set the legal trap," I told him. "Set it deep. Let him think that he has won, and then we will absolutely bury him." Thomas did not waste a single second after my declaration. He sat back down in his heavy leather chair and began outlining the brutal reality of our situation. "Richard," he said, keeping his voice incredibly calm and measured, "I know every fiber of your being wants to take that toxicology report straight to the local police precinct right now. You want to see squad cars pull up to his corporate office and drag him out in handcuffs. But you cannot do that. If we go to the local authorities with just a tin of poisoned tea and a forged document, Jason will hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the state before the police even finish writing their report. He will look the detectives right in the eye, shed those fake tears of his, and place every single ounce of the blame squarely on your dead wife. He will say Beatrice was mentally unstable. He will claim she handled all the finances, forged the signatures on her own, and brewed the tea without his knowledge. He will say he thought the real estate was bought with legitimate investment returns. Because Beatrice is dead and cannot testify, the local district attorney will likely refuse to prosecute him. He will walk away completely free, and you will still be evicted. We cannot just prove that a crime happened. We have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jason was the mastermind pulling the strings the entire time." I listened carefully, my blood running cold at how easily my son could slip through the cracks of the justice system. How do we prove he orchestrated it? I asked, leaning forward over the polished wood of the desk. Thomas clasped his hands together. We need a digital footprint, he explained. We need to tie the money transfers and the insurance policy applications directly to him. I am bringing in a team of forensic accountants to tear his tech company apart from the inside out. But I need time to do that, Richard. I need at least a week to subpoena the electronic records without him knowing we are coming. To buy that time, you have to do the hardest thing you have ever done in your life. You have to go back to your house, pick up the phone, and surrender. You need to make Jason believe that his psychological warfare worked perfectly. You must convince him that you are a broken, terrified old man who has finally accepted defeat. You need to tell him you will sign the house over. The thought of begging my son made my stomach physically churn. The idea of apologizing to the man who wanted me dead was repulsive, but I looked at the black folder containing the life insurance policies on Thomas's desk, and the revulsion turned into a cold, calculated strength. I can do it, I told Thomas. I left the law office and drove back to my empty house. The eviction notices were still piled on the kitchen table, a harsh reminder of the ticking clock. I sat down in the quiet kitchen and stared at the telephone. I needed to give the performance of a lifetime. I needed to channel all the genuine sorrow, the deep betrayal, and the crushing exhaustion I had felt over the last week and project it outward. I closed my eyes and practiced my breathing. I made my breathing shallow and shaky. I let my voice drop to a weak, pathetic whisper. When I felt completely immersed in the role of a defeated victim, I picked up the receiver and dialed his number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Hello, Jason said, his voice clipped and impatient, sounding like a busy executive who did not have time for a nuisance. Jason. It is, Dad, I said. I forced my voice to crack on the first syllable. I let out a long, shuddering sigh directly into the microphone. I have been sitting here all day looking at these legal notices. I am so tired, Jason. I am just so incredibly tired. I cannot fight this anymore. I do not have the money, and my heart cannot take the stress. I feel so weak. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the smug satisfaction radiating through the phone. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a convincing sob from my throat. You win, Jason, I cried softly. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the house over to you. Just please, please do not let the county throw me out on the street. Help me get into that nursing home you showed me. I just want to rest. The shift in his tone was immediate and nauseating. The cold impatience vanished, replaced by the patronizing, sweet voice of a victorious predator. I knew you would finally come to your senses, Dad, Jason said smoothly. There is no need for more tears. This is exactly what is best for everyone involved. I will call my legal team right now and tell them to completely halt the eviction process. We will do this the right way. I will set up an appointment at the notary office downtown for next Friday morning. We can sign the deed transfer, and then Monica and I will personally drive you to the care facility to get you checked into your new room. It will be a wonderful, fresh start for all of us. Next Friday, I repeated, keeping my voice thoroughly shaky and submissive. Yes, I promise you I will be there. I hung up the phone and wiped a stray fake tear from my cheek. I sat in the silent kitchen staring at the receiver. He believed every single word of it. My son thought he was walking into a routine real estate transfer to claim his final prize. He had no idea he was walking straight into a federal snare. The days leading up to that Friday morning meeting felt like an agonizing crawl through enemy territory. I stayed locked inside my silent house, playing my part to absolute perfection. I let the property look exactly like the neglected sanctuary of a man who had completely given up on his existence. Whenever Jason called to check on my progress, I made sure my voice trembled. I told him I was spending my days looking at brochures for the state-funded nursing facility, trying to decide what few items of clothing I would bring. He would offer his fake patronizing sympathy, telling me how brave I was being, and how much easier my life would be once I surrendered the burden of homeownership. He was absolutely drunk on his own perceived victory. He believed he had broken the final barrier standing between him and his total financial independence. But while he was busy gloating over his triumph, Thomas Reed and his team of forensic investigators were digging furiously into the darkest corners of my son's corporate empire. On Wednesday afternoon, Thomas called me from his secure office line. His voice held a sharp, dangerous edge of excitement. "Richard," he said, "you are not going to believe the sheer scale of their arrogance." I asked him what his accountants had uncovered. Thomas explained that Jason and Monica were not just satisfied with stealing the 3 luxury condominiums and forcing me onto the street. Believing my threat was neutralized and the secret of the stolen money safely buried with Beatrice, they decided to dramatically accelerate their grand financial plans. They had become hopelessly addicted to the intoxicating rush of unearned wealth. Thomas tapped into his network of financial contacts and discovered that Jason recently walked into a major corporate bank downtown. He did not go there to make a simple deposit. He went there to leverage his stolen real estate empire. Jason presented the deeds to the 3 prime downtown rental properties to the bank executives. Because those properties were purchased entirely with the cash my wife stole over 40 years, they carried absolutely no mortgage debt. They were highly lucrative, unencumbered assets sitting in the most expensive zip code in the entire city. Jason used those 3 stolen condominiums as direct collateral to secure a massive commercial loan. Thomas told me the exact figure, and it made my stomach drop. My son had successfully secured a $3 million line of credit. He was using the blood and sweat of my 40 years of labor as a financial springboard to launch himself into the stratosphere of the ultra-wealthy. I listened in absolute stunned silence as Thomas broke down exactly how they planned to spend the $3 million. Half of the massive loan was earmarked for an aggressive, immediate expansion of his technology startup. Jason was using the stolen funds to hire new executives, launch a massive national marketing campaign, and prepare his company for a highly lucrative initial public offering. He wanted to be recognized as a visionary genius on the cover of business magazines, completely funding his vanity project with the money his mother embezzled. But the other half of the $3 million loan was designated for something entirely personal and infinitely more disgusting. Monica had officially signed a contract to purchase a massive, sprawling plot of land in one of the most exclusive, heavily gated communities in the state. She had already retained a firm of elite architects to design a sprawling mega mansion. The blueprints included a massive heated swimming pool, a private tennis court, and a 6-car garage to house the luxury vehicles they planned to purchase. While I was sitting in my dark kitchen shivering and wondering how I was going to survive in a low-income care facility, my daughter-in-law was picking out imported Italian marble for her new foyer. They were absolutely blinded by their own bottomless greed. They felt completely invincible. But as Thomas continued to speak, the initial shock in my chest transformed into a deep, resounding satisfaction. Jason thought he was a brilliant businessman executing a flawless strategy. In reality, his arrogance had just handed us the ultimate weapon. By using those 3 stolen condominiums as collateral for a massive corporate loan, Jason had fundamentally changed the nature of his crime. If he had simply kept the properties, this might have remained a complicated civil dispute over a stolen inheritance and a forged power of attorney. But the moment he walked into a federally insured bank and used embezzled, untaxed assets to secure a loan, he crossed a terrifying legal threshold. He committed massive, undeniable federal bank fraud. He had essentially wrapped a noose around his own neck, handed the rope directly to the federal government, and then gleefully jumped off the chair. Thomas explained that the corporate bank now had a vested interest in the legitimacy of those properties. When the authorities discovered the real estate was purchased with stolen funds, the bank would immediately freeze every single asset connected to Jason. His technology company, his bank accounts, his luxury cars, and his grand plans for a mega mansion would be locked down tight in a matter of seconds. Let them dream, Richard Thomas said, his voice echoing with the promise of absolute destruction. Let them pick out their marble countertops and plan their corporate expansions. They are building a castle on a foundation of pure sand, and we are going to wash it all away on Friday morning. I thanked Thomas and hung up the phone. I looked around my quiet living room, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. Jason and Monica thought they were climbing to the very top of the world. They had absolutely no idea they were actually digging their own graves, fueled by an arrogance that would become their ultimate undoing. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the jaws were ready to snap shut. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that matched the atmosphere inside my empty house. I was exactly 24 hours away from the scheduled meeting at the notary office. I spent the early hours pacing across the living room floor, my mind racing with the terrifying reality of what we were about to do. I had spent my entire life building a safety net for my family, and now I was preparing to detonate a legal bomb underneath the only child I had left. But every time a brief flicker of doubt entered my mind, I forced myself to remember the bitter metallic taste of that dark herbal tea. I remembered the terrifying numbness in my shaking hands and the agonizing pressure in my failing chest. Any lingering parental sympathy vanished instantly, replaced entirely by an unbreakable iron resolve. Just before noon, my cell phone rang, shattering the dead silence of the hallway. It was Thomas Reed. He did not bother with polite pleasantries. He simply told me that his team of forensic accountants had finally cracked the digital vault, and I needed to get down to his downtown office immediately. I grabbed my coat and drove into the city, fighting through the thick midday traffic. When I pushed open the glass doors of the law firm, Thomas was already waiting for me in the main lobby. He looked exhausted, but he radiated a dangerous, predatory energy. He led me past his corner office and directed me into a large, windowless conference room in the back of the building. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany table covered in tangled wires, glowing laptop screens, and towering stacks of printed data logs. Two men in crisp white shirts were typing furiously at their keyboards. Thomas introduced the older man standing at the head of the table as David. He was the lead digital forensic investigator Thomas hired to tear my son's electronic life apart. I took a seat at the edge of the table, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. David closed his silver laptop, took off his glasses, and looked at me with a solemn expression. He explained that in the modern corporate world, money never moves completely in the shadows. He told me that every single electronic financial transaction leaves a permanent, undeniable digital footprint. David handed me a thick binder filled with complex spreadsheets and rows of numerical routing codes. He explained that over the last 48 hours, his team had successfully subpoenaed the Internet Protocol addresses for every major electronic transaction connected to my stolen assets. They pulled the official digital records for the initial wire transfers that moved my paychecks from the hidden bank account into the shell companies purchasing the real estate. They also managed to pull the electronic signatures used to finalize the fraudulent reverse mortgage on my home. And most importantly, they acquired the exact digital location where the 3 multi-million-dollar life insurance policies were originally drafted and submitted to the national brokers. Up until this very moment, I had operated under a horrifying, yet relatively simple assumption. I truly believed my wife was the grand architect of this nightmare. I thought Beatrice sat alone at her vanity desk in our suburban home using her personal laptop to forge my signature and drain my life savings while I was working. I assumed Jason was simply a willing recipient of her stolen money. But David shook his head slowly, shattering that assumption into a million pieces. He pointed his pen to a column of numbers highlighted in yellow ink on the spreadsheet. He explained that not a single one of those massive financial transactions originated from my home internet network. Not a single wire transfer, fraudulent loan application, or life insurance policy was processed using Beatrice's phone or home computer. The digital footprints did not point to my house at all. Instead, every single Internet Protocol address traced back directly to a highly secure encrypted server located on the top floor of Jason's corporate tech headquarters. The terrifying implications hit me with the brutal force of a speeding freight train. Jason was not just a greedy child happily accepting his mother's stolen gifts. He was the absolute puppet master of the entire operation. He was the brilliant, calculating mastermind who designed the complex fraudulent infrastructure from the very beginning. He sat comfortably in his plush corner office, coldly drafting the life insurance policies that put a literal price tag on my head. He personally initiated the electronic wire transfers that laundered my hard-earned money into his luxury real estate empire. Beatrice was truly nothing more than his devoted bagman and his obedient poisoner. She was the one physically going to the bank every Thursday to make the cash deposits, and she was the one brewing the toxic tea, but Jason was the man pulling every single string from the safety of his corporate fortress. He had weaponized his own mother's unconditional love, turning her into a federal criminal and a cold-blooded killer just to fund his insatiable greed. He let her take all the physical risks while he managed the digital execution. The profound evil required to orchestrate such a flawless betrayal was almost impossible for my mind to fully comprehend. My only son had completely detached himself from any sense of basic human morality. He viewed me strictly as nothing but a disposable financial asset, a biological bank account that needed to be systematically drained and then quietly eliminated. I slowly closed the thick black binder and looked up at Thomas. The final missing piece of the terrifying puzzle had firmly locked into place. We now possessed the undeniable airtight proof required to bypass the local police entirely and trigger a truly massive federal raid. Jason's brilliant technology empire was about to become his permanent prison. The puppet master had left his fingerprints everywhere, and tomorrow morning we were going to cut his strings forever. Thomas closed the thick binder and looked at me with a grim smile. The usual path for a financial dispute like this would be to file a civil lawsuit. He explained, his voice low and serious. We could drag your son into county court, file endless motions, and fight his expensive corporate lawyers for years. During that time, he could quietly liquidate the assets, move the money offshore, and drag out the legal process until you ran out of money or died of old age. That is exactly what Jason expects us to do if we ever found out the truth about his operation. He expects a slow, expensive civil war that he can win through pure financial attrition. But we are not going to do that, Richard. We are not going to give him a single day to prepare, and we are certainly not going to play by his rules. We are bypassing the civil court system entirely. We are going straight to the federal government. For the rest of the afternoon, I sat in the quiet conference room and watched Thomas and his legal team assemble the ultimate weapon. They did not draft a standard civil complaint. Instead, they compiled a massive, airtight federal dossier. They printed out every single piece of evidence we had gathered over the last week and meticulously organized it into distinct, undeniable categories of criminal activity. Into the first section went the Chase Bank safe deposit box, records, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the property deeds listing Jason as the sole owner. Into the second section went the digital forensic reports, tracing the internet protocol addresses of the wire transfers directly back to the secure servers at his technology company. And into the third, most devastating section, Thomas placed the $4 million life insurance policies alongside the official toxicology report, proving the presence of lethal arsenic in the herbal tea. It was a complete, flawless narrative of a 40-year financial heist that ultimately escalated into an attempted homicide. With the dossier complete, Thomas picked up his secure telephone and made his first call. He did not dial the local police precinct. He dialed a direct number for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. As a former state prosecutor, Thomas knew exactly how the financial justice system operated. The most efficient way to completely destroy a criminal empire is not to arrest the people right away, but to cut off their oxygen supply. And in the corporate world, oxygen is money. Thomas spoke to a senior federal agent on the line outlining the precise details of Jason's tax evasion. He explained that Jason had been receiving thousands of dollars in monthly rental income from those 3 luxury condominiums for years. Because the initial purchase capital was embezzled and completely untaxed, every single dollar of revenue generated by those properties constituted severe federal tax fraud. Furthermore, Jason had just used those fraudulent assets to secure a $3 million commercial loan. Thomas offered to hand-deliver the entire digital footprint. The agent on the other end of the line was highly receptive. By utilizing the Internal Revenue Service, we ensured that the federal government would instantly freeze every single bank account, line of credit, and corporate asset associated with my son by tomorrow morning, entirely crippling his ability to run or fight back. But freezing his money was only the first part of the strategy. After ending his call with the tax authorities, Thomas dialed his most powerful contact yet. He reached out to a specialized unit within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When the agent answered, Thomas wasted no time. He laid out the chilling reality of the multi-million-dollar life insurance policies and the poison tea. He explained that my son had utilized interstate wire networks to process fraudulent insurance applications, which constituted federal wire fraud. But far more importantly, the IP addresses proved a clear, premeditated conspiracy to commit murder across state lines. This was no longer just a white-collar crime involving stolen real estate and forged signatures. This was a highly organized, lethal plot orchestrated by a corporate executive against a vulnerable senior citizen for massive financial gain. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not take such allegations lightly, especially when handed a perfectly documented trail of evidence, including chemical lab results and digital server logs. Thomas requested emergency intervention, coordinating a synchronized strike that would coincide perfectly with our scheduled real estate closing. By the time the sun began to set over the Philadelphia skyline, the federal snare was completely irrevocably set. Thomas hung up the phone for the final time and let out a long, exhausted breath. He looked across the conference table at me, his eyes reflecting the gravity of what we had just unleashed. "The orders have been signed, Richard," he told me quietly. "The tax freeze will go into absolute effect at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The moment the banks open their doors, his technology company, his personal checking accounts, and his newly approved $3 million commercial loan will all be completely frozen by the federal government. He will not have access to a single penny, and the federal agents will be waiting in the wings to execute the criminal warrants." I left the law office and drove back to my house one last time. I walked through the quiet rooms looking at the packed cardboard boxes I had prepared when I thought I was defeated. I did not unpack them. I just sat in my armchair, feeling a deep, profound stillness inside my soul. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into that notary office pretending to be a broken, surrendered old man. I would sit across from my arrogant son and my cruel daughter-in-law. But I would not be surrendering my home. I would be delivering them directly into a devastating, absolutely inescapable federal trap from which they would never, ever be able to escape. Friday morning arrived with a biting chill in the air. I woke up long before dawn, my mind entirely clear. There were no tears left to shed, no lingering doubts to wrestle with. I put on my oldest, most worn-out suit, making myself look as fragile and pathetic as possible. I drove into downtown Philadelphia, navigating the busy traffic with the calm precision of a man walking to the gallows, only I was not the one wearing the noose. I parked my truck a few blocks away from the prestigious legal building. The glass and steel tower loomed over the street, a massive monument to corporate wealth. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. The doors opened to a pristine reception area, all white marble and polished chrome. The receptionist offered me a pitying smile, instructed beforehand about the sad old man coming to surrender his property. She directed me down a long corridor toward the main conference room. My heart beat a steady drum. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside. The room was flooded with natural light from the floor to ceiling windows overlooking the city. Sitting at the far end of a massive oak table was my daughter-in-law, Monica. She wore a pristine white Chanel suit adorned with heavy gold jewelry. She did not lower her voice or acknowledge my entrance. She was practically shouting into her cell phone, bragging to one of her friends about a month-long European vacation they had just booked. I listened closely as she loudly detailed the private villa they were renting in Tuscany, the chartered yacht waiting in the Mediterranean, and the exclusive shopping trips planned in Paris. She was already spending the commercial loan, treating my 40 years of physical labor like a winning lottery ticket she had scratched off herself. She laughed loudly, a sharp grating sound that echoed off the thick glass walls. I stood near the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane I dug out of my closet for this performance. I let my shoulders slump forward, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. Jason stood near the window, sipping an espresso. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit. When he saw me, he quickly set his cup down and walked over, wearing that same sickeningly sweet expression of artificial sympathy. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with condescending warmth, "I am so glad you made it safely. Please come sit down." He gently took my arm and guided me toward a leather chair near the center of the table. He was putting on a magnificent show for the notary public, a stern woman sitting quietly at the head of the table, organizing legal papers. Jason wanted to ensure there were official witnesses to his supposed generosity. He poured me a glass of water and patted my shoulder. "I know this is a difficult morning for you, Dad," he announced loudly, making sure the notary heard every word. "But you are doing the right thing. This is for your own safety and your own health. Once we get this paperwork finalized, Monica and I will drive you straight to the Whispering Pines Care Center. We already paid your first month of rent, and they have a lovely room waiting for you." Monica finally ended her phone call. She dropped the phone into her designer handbag and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She did not say a single word to me. She simply crossed her arms and stared out the window, clearly annoyed that she had to be present for the disposal of her father-in-law. The notary cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. "Gentlemen," she began professionally, "we are here to execute a quitclaim deed transfer for the property located in the Philadelphia suburbs, transferring total legal ownership from Richard Alden to Jason Alden. Before we begin, Mr. Alden, I must ask you a standard legal question. Are you signing these documents of your own free will without any coercion or duress?" I looked up at the notary. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I rested them on the edge of the oak table. "Yes, madam," I whispered softly. "I am doing this willingly." The notary nodded, satisfied with my pathetic display. She took the thick stack of papers and slid them toward the center of the table. Jason took his seat directly across from me. He reached out and pulled the documents closer to him, quickly scanning the pages to ensure his lawyers had drafted everything to his exact specifications. Satisfied, he looked up at me. The mask of the loving son slipped away entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a victorious predator. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. He slowly picked up a sleek, heavy black fountain pen. He held it in his hand for a moment, savoring his ultimate triumph. Then, with a slow, arrogant smirk, he slid the final deed transfer across the polished oak surface. The paper came to a stop directly in front of me. He tossed the black pen on top of the document. The metallic clatter echoed loudly in the silent room. "There it is, old man," he whispered, his voice so low that only I could hear the pure malice dripping from his words. "Sign the paper. Give me the house, and I will let you live out your pathetic final days in peace. Do not make this any harder than it has to be." I stared down at the blank signature line, listening to the heavy ticking of the clock on the wall, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I knew my attorney Thomas was waiting just outside the heavy wooden doors, holding the documents that would completely destroy my son's entire existence. I took a deep breath, preparing to unleash absolute hell upon the two monsters sitting right across from me today. I reached out and picked up the heavy black fountain pen. The smooth metal felt cold against my palm. Jason leaned forward, eagerly waiting. "Go ahead, Dad," he coaxed, his voice smooth. "Just sign on the dotted line and all this stress will finally be over for you." Monica stopped staring out the window and turned to watch a cruel smile playing on her lips. She wanted to witness the exact moment I surrendered my dignity. I held the pen over the signature line. I looked down at the forged document, then slowly raised my head. I looked directly into my son's eyes. The pathetic, shaking old man routine vanished from my face. My hands stopped trembling. I gripped the expensive pen with both hands and applied a sudden violent pressure. With a loud, sharp crack, the thick plastic and metal snapped completely in half. Dark blue ink exploded across the pristine white quitclaim deed, ruining the document instantly. Jason jumped back in his chair, staring at the ruined paperwork in absolute shock. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. Monica gasped, clutching her designer handbag. Before Jason could yell again, the heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open with a forceful thud. The notary public jumped in her seat. Thomas Reed strode into the room. He did not look like a friendly mediator. He looked like an executioner. He wore a sharp charcoal suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. His predatory eyes instantly locked onto Jason. "Who the hell are you?" Jason demanded, standing up from his chair. "This is a private legal meeting. Get out before I call building security." Thomas did not stop walking. He ignored Jason entirely and stepped right up to the massive oak table. He unlatched his briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound by a heavy blue legal folder. He slammed the folder down onto the center of the table with a deafening smack. The sound echoed off the glass walls, silencing the room. "My name is Thomas Reed," he announced, his voice booming with authority. "I legally represent your father, and as of this morning, this meeting is officially over." Jason scoffed, trying to regain his composure. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and rage. "You brought a lawyer, Dad," he sneered. "What is he going to do?" "Beg me for a better nursing home. You have no money to pay him." Thomas smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that made the blood drain from Monica's face. "He does not need to beg, Jason," Thomas said smoothly. "He just needed to keep you occupied while the federal government seized your entire life." Jason froze. He looked down at the thick blue folder. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its arrogant edge. Thomas opened the folder and spread the official documents across the table. "These are emergency asset freeze orders," Thomas explained, his tone methodical and relentless. "They were executed at exactly 8 o'clock this morning by the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Jason, the 3 luxury rental condominiums in Rittenhouse Square that you claim as personal assets were purchased using stolen funds. Over 40 years, your mother embezzled over $1 million from your father to buy those properties in cash." Jason swallowed hard, his eyes darting across the official government seals stamped on the documents. "You cannot prove that," Jason stammered. "My mother managed the finances. I had nothing to do with it." Thomas let out a dark chuckle. "We already proved it, Jason. We hired a forensic accounting firm. We subpoenaed the Internet Protocol addresses for every single wire transfer and fraudulent application. Every electronic footprint leads directly back to the secure servers inside your corporate headquarters. You orchestrated the entire theft. But that is not even the worst part of your morning." Thomas leaned over the table, getting right into Jason's face. "You used those stolen properties as collateral to secure a $3 million commercial loan. You committed massive federal bank fraud. Because those initial properties were bought with untaxed embezzled cash, the Internal Revenue Service has officially frozen every single asset tied to your name. Your luxury condos are frozen. Your personal checking accounts are frozen. The $3 million commercial loan you just secured is completely locked down, and your precious technology startup is currently surrounded by federal auditors. You are entirely bankrupt, Jason. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee." Monica let out a gasp. She opened her handbag, her hands shaking violently. She pulled out her cell phone and rapidly tapped the screen, trying to log into her mobile banking application. "No," she whimpered, staring at the glowing screen in absolute horror. "No, this cannot be right. It says our accounts are locked. Jason, it says we have a zero balance." Jason ignored her. He was staring at Thomas, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. The invincible chief executive officer was dissolving into a panicked, terrified criminal. He looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Dad," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Dad, you have to stop this. I will give you the house back. Just tell your lawyer to call off the federal agents." I remained seated. I looked at the broken pieces of the pen leaking ink onto the table, and then I looked up at my son. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The love I once held for my boy had died the moment I learned he was poisoning me. "I did not do this to you, Jason," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any mercy. "You did this to yourself. You built a house of cards using my blood, and I simply opened the window to let the wind blow it down. I promised you I would show up today, and I did. But I never promised I was going to surrender." Jason stared at me, his face completely devoid of color. The arrogant sneer he had worn just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the wild, frantic look of a cornered animal. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. He bumped into the edge of the conference table, gripping the oak surface to steady himself. His chest heaved rapidly as he desperately searched for a way out of the trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. He looked at Thomas, then back at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic manufactured innocence. "You are making a terrible mistake," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. It was Mom. She was the one who went to the bank every Thursday. She was the one who hid the account. She managed all the finances, Dad, you know she did. She must have set up those shell companies and put the properties in my name without telling me. She bought those condos for me because she knew you would never support my dreams. I am completely innocent. You are destroying your own son over the crimes of a dead woman." The sheer audacity of his lie, the cowardly attempt to hide behind the grave of the mother who had loved him enough to destroy her own soul, made the blood roar in my ears. I slowly stood up from my chair. I did not need the wooden cane anymore. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, looking down at the pathetic creature I had raised. Thomas opened the second folder in his leather briefcase and handed me the thick stack of digital forensic reports. I took the heavy packet and threw it directly into Jason's face. The thick sheets of paper scattered across his chest and fluttered to the floor around his feet. "Read the logs." Jason, I commanded, my voice echoing like thunder in the enclosed glass room. Every single internet protocol address for those massive electronic wire transfers traces directly back to the private encrypted server sitting inside your corner office. You drafted the fraudulent power of attorney. You submitted the applications for the commercial loan. You sat in your leather executive chair and pushed the buttons that drained my life savings. Jason looked down at the scattered papers, his lips trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, but I did not give him the chance to formulate another lie. Thomas handed me the final black folder. I gripped it tightly, stepping around the table until I was standing merely inches away from my son. I opened the folder and thrust the toxicology report and the multi-million-dollar life insurance policies against his chest, forcing him to take them. "You insured my life for $4 million. I whispered, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "You put a literal price tag on my head, and then you provided the murder weapon. You bought the arsenic, Jason. You gave her the poison, and you let her serve it to me in a teacup every single Thursday night. You watched my hands shake. You watched my heart fail. You waited for me to die so you could collect your final paycheck. You signed the transfers from your office, Jason. You bought the poison." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Jason stared at the word arsenic printed on the official laboratory letterhead. The last remaining shred of his denial evaporated. He knew it was entirely over. He dropped the papers, his knees buckling slightly. Before he could utter a single word of defense, the heavy double doors of the conference room burst open with an explosive, deafening crash. 6 federal agents stormed into the room, their dark tactical jackets bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. 2 agents immediately flanked the terrified notary public, instructing her to step away from the table. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern, unforgiving face, marched directly toward my son. Jason Alden, the agent announced, his voice carrying the full, crushing weight of federal authority. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Jason did not fight them. All the fight had completely left his body. He stood there paralyzed as the agents roughly grabbed his arms, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the polished oak table. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room like a gunshot. No, Jason sobbed, his face pressed against the ruined quitclaim deed covered in dark blue ink. Please, Dad, you have to help me. I am your son. Please tell them to stop. He was openly weeping now, his tears mixing with the ink on the table, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant executive he pretended to be. A sudden piercing scream shattered the air. Monica, who had been standing frozen by the window, suddenly lunged forward. She did not run to comfort her husband. She ran toward him with her hands raised into claws. She slapped him violently across the face, her heavy gold rings leaving a bright red gash on his cheek. You ruined my life, she screamed hysterically. Her immaculate white suit wrinkled as she thrashed against the agents who quickly pulled her away. You told me we were rich. You told me the money was clean. You completely destroyed my entire life, you stupid, arrogant fool. She collapsed onto her knees, the expensive fabric of her skirt pooling on the hardwood floor. She crawled toward me, tears ruining her perfect makeup, begging for mercy. Richard, please help me, she sobbed loudly. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply adjusted my heavy coat, stepped right over her weeping body, and walked straight out of the room forever. I walked out of that glass tower and stepped into the crisp morning air of downtown Philadelphia. For the first time in a week, my chest felt incredibly light. I did not look back. I did not wait to watch them parade my son through the lobby in handcuffs. The federal justice system moved with a terrifying absolute efficiency that left absolutely no room for negotiation or high-priced defense strategies. Because we had handed the authorities a perfectly documented trail of digital forensics chemical laboratory results and forged financial documents, Jason was completely cornered. His expensive corporate lawyers took one look at the sheer mountain of evidence and advised him to plead guilty. But the federal prosecutors were not interested in offering him a lenient deal. They wanted to make an absolute example out of a wealthy executive who used his own mother to slowly poison his father for insurance money. During the sentencing hearing, Jason stood before the federal judge crying those same fake tears he had used on me in my kitchen. He begged for mercy, claiming he was driven by the overwhelming pressure to succeed in the corporate world. The judge was entirely unmoved. Jason was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Because the convictions included federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, there was absolutely no possibility of early parole. The brilliant chief executive officer was reduced to a federal inmate number, stripped of his tailored suits, and locked in a concrete cell where his arrogance could not save him. His empire of lies collapsed in a spectacular fashion, leaving him with absolutely nothing but cold steel bars and profound regret. Monica did not fare much better. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, she desperately tried to play the role of the innocent, victimized wife. She went on television crying and claiming she had absolutely no idea where the money for her luxurious lifestyle came from. But the forensic accountants found her digital fingerprints all over the bank accounts. She had personally signed the paperwork for the $3 million commercial loan, and she was the one actively routing the stolen rental income to pay for her Italian vacations and designer clothes. The federal government indicted her as a direct accessory to wire fraud and money laundering. To avoid serving a lengthy prison sentence herself, she was forced to surrender absolutely everything. The massive plot of land she purchased for her mega mansion was seized by the state. Her luxury vehicles were towed away in the middle of the night. Her designer wardrobe and expensive jewelry were auctioned off by the federal authorities. The most devastating blow came from the family court system. A judge deemed her home environment entirely toxic and financially unstable, stripping her of custody. Her children were sent to live with her older sister in another state. Monica, who had spent years looking down her nose at me and mocking my working-class life, was left completely penniless. She was forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, taking a minimum wage job just to afford her groceries. While Jason and Monica faced the absolute destruction of their lives, Thomas Reed worked relentlessly with the Internal Revenue Service to unravel the 40-year financial knot my wife had tied. The federal authorities moved swiftly to liquidate every single asset tied to the stolen funds. They seized Jason's technology company, selling off its software patents and office equipment to the highest bidder. They took immediate possession of the 3 highly lucrative rental condominiums in Rittenhouse Square and placed them on the open real estate market. Because those properties were located in such a desirable neighborhood, they sold for significantly more than their original purchase price. The federal government used the proceeds from those sales to systematically correct the massive financial damage inflicted upon me. The very first thing they did was address the fraudulent reverse mortgage that had nearly cost me my home. Armed with the irrefutable proof of the forged power of attorney, Thomas forced the predatory lending company to completely dissolve the loan. The massive $500,000 debt was wiped completely clean from the public record. The tax delinquency notice that terrified me a few weeks ago was paid in full using the liquidated assets. The heavy threat of foreclosure evaporated entirely. My beautiful colonial home, the house I had broken my back to pay for, was once again owned free and clear. But the justice did not stop with simply saving my house. After the federal government took their necessary taxes from the liquidated estate, the remaining balance was mandated to be returned to the original victim. Just 3 months after that explosive morning in the notary office, I received a certified letter from the Federal Treasury. Enclosed was a cashier's check that represented the full return of my stolen life savings. It was not just the original amount. The court had ordered that the funds be returned with decades of compounding interest attached. The money that Beatrice had siphoned away every Thursday afternoon was restored to my name, leaving me with a financial safety net far larger than I had ever imagined possible. I deposited the funds into a new, highly secure account at a different bank, managing every single penny myself. I paid Thomas Reed his well-deserved legal fees, shaking the hand of the ruthless gladiator who had saved my life. As I sat in my quiet living room, looking out the window at my manicured lawn, I felt a profound sense of closure. The people who had tried to destroy me were rotting in prison or living in absolute poverty. The poison was gone from my home, and the financial terror was completely over. I had faced the ultimate betrayal, survived the deadliest of traps, and emerged entirely victorious. The universe had finally delivered its righteous punishment. But even with my bank accounts completely restored and the heavy threat of foreclosure entirely removed from my life, I quickly realized that something fundamental was still broken. I spent the next few weeks trying to settle back into my normal routine. I tried to enjoy the quiet mornings in my kitchen. I tried to sit in my favorite recliner and watch the evening news. But the peace I expected to feel never truly arrived. Every time I walked past the antique vanity in the master bedroom, my chest tightened. I could not look at the heavy oak dining table. I remembered Jason sitting there, tossing that black pen at me and demanding I surrender my dignity. I could not walk down into the basement without remembering the hidden tin of poisoned tea sitting on the top shelf. This beautiful colonial house, the sanctuary I had broken my back to provide for my family, no longer felt like a home. It felt like a massive, beautifully decorated tomb. It was permanently tainted by the stench of betrayal and the haunting memory of the woman who had smiled at me while she slowly tried to completely stop my failing physical heart. I realized that holding on to the physical structure meant holding on to the pain. If I truly wanted to be free, I had to let it all go. So I picked up the phone and called a local real estate agent. I did not care about waiting for the perfect market conditions. I listed the house fully furnished, walking away from the antique rugs, the crystal vases, and the heavy mahogany furniture that my wife had purchased with my stolen paychecks. Because the property was located in a highly desirable neighborhood and completely free of any financial encumbrances, it sold immediately. I packed exactly 2 suitcases. I only took my clothing, a few favorite books, and the basic tools I had owned since I was a young man. The day I handed the keys over to the new owners, a young couple with a newborn baby, I felt an incredibly profound weight physically lift off my shoulders. I was walking away from 40 years of history, but I was not walking away empty-handed. I was walking away with my life, my health, and my absolute freedom. I used a small fraction of my newly restored wealth to purchase a vehicle. It was a magnificent luxury recreational vehicle, equipped with a full kitchen, a comfortable bedroom, and large panoramic windows that would allow me to watch the world change around me. For 40 years, I had been completely anchored to the freezing winters of the Northeast, working endlessly to support a family that secretly despised me. Now the entire country was open to me. I mapped out a route that would take me down the eastern seaboard, through the warm southern states, and eventually out toward the vast deserts of the American Southwest. I wanted to see new horizons every day. But before I drove out of Philadelphia for good, I had one final piece of business to conduct. I drove the massive vehicle downtown and parked near the financial district. I walked into the glass tower and took the elevator up to see Thomas Reed one last time. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a cup of black coffee. We sat in his office and I told him my plans for the road. He smiled, genuinely happy to see the color back in my face and the steady firmness in my hands. But I was not just visiting. I slid a certified cashier's check across his heavy wooden desk. It was for a very substantial amount of money. Thomas looked at the number and raised his eyebrows in surprise. I explained that I did not need millions of dollars to live out my remaining years in a recreational vehicle. I told him to take that money and establish a dedicated legal defense fund. I wanted him to create a specialized task force designed exclusively to protect elderly citizens who were actively being financially abused by their own families. I knew I was incredibly lucky. I had physical strength. I had the pure intuition to fight back before the poison finished its job. But there were thousands of older men and women sitting in lonely houses, completely vulnerable, being preyed upon by greedy children and manipulative spouses who thought they were an easy target. I wanted my stolen money to become a weapon for those people. I wanted Thomas to be their shark. He looked at the check, then looked up at me with profound respect. He promised me he would build a program that would make predatory relatives completely terrified to steal another single dime from innocent parents. I left the law office, walked back to my vehicle, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine, feeling the powerful, steady rumble beneath my feet. I pulled out onto the highway, leaving the towering skyline of Philadelphia shrinking in my rearview mirror. The road ahead of me was wide open, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun. I was 70 years old, but as I drove toward the state line, I felt like a man who had just been born again. My hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute certainty. My heart felt incredibly strong. I am completely free of the toxic weight that had dragged me down for half a decade. I survived the ultimate betrayal because I refused to be a victim. I took control back. Sometimes to survive, you have to cut off the very branch you spent your whole life nurturing. Blood is not an excuse for abuse. What do you think of Jason's punishment? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to send a super. Thanks if this story gave you strength. Thank you for listening to my journey today. I will see you on the open road.